From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Inflation hits 8.6% year over year as the January 6 House Committee gives an overview of its evidence on the Capitol riot. Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We're joined today by my colleagues, columnist Kim Strassel and editorial writer Monet Ukwe-Barua. Welcome to you both. Every month it seems we are promised peak inflation, and every month we don't seem to get it. The Labor Department reported on Friday that prices in May were up 8.6% from a year ago. That's a new high under President Biden, beating the March figure of 8.5%. And here's a piece of the president's response, speaking during a visit to the Port of Los Angeles.
I understand inflation is a real challenge to American families. Today's inflation report confirmed what Americans already know. Putin's price hike is hitting America hard. Gas prices at the pump, energy and food prices account for half of the monthly price increases since May. Inflation outside of energy and food, what the economists call core inflation, moderated the last 2 months. Not enough, but it moderated. It's come down. And we need it to come down much more quickly. My administration is going to continue everything we can to lower the prices to the American people, and the Congress has to act, and they have been of late.
Kim, he is still outselling Putin's price hike, and I guess my reaction is that I had no idea that Vladimir Putin had such a grip on American shelter, which was up 5.5%, and transportation services, which was up 7.9%.
Yeah, well, first of all, an important correction. The president was wrong in what he just said there. Core inflation did not moderate, did not come down a little bit. It stayed at 0.6%, which was exactly what it was in April. So that is not, in fact, the case. And indeed, that is the real problem for him, is that people were expecting that the overall inflation rate might go up some because of hikes in energy prices. But people were looking at that core number, hoping that it would, in fact, fall. It did not. And it just goes to show how incredibly widespread this inflation is. It is pretty stunning that the president is doubling down on the Putin price hike argument. By the way, just to point out, when Biden took office back in January of 2021, inflation was 1.4%. It had already climbed to 7.4% by the time Putin invaded Russia. So yes, is all of this feeding in a little bit into some of those energy prices? Sure. But that is not the problem. The problem, as you said, is that this is swept across every good and service that there is, including shelter, groceries up nearly 12%, energy up 35%. And these are the bulk of household spendings, food, energy, and shelter. And this is why the other thing that came out today is people's confidence in the economy continues to fall.
And just as a reminder, the reason that economists look at core inflation is because the categories of food and energy are more volatile. They tend to move around a lot. And so one example was the drop in energy prices in April was a prime reason that the overall inflation rate dipped a little bit. But now we see that gas pump prices have taken all of that relief back. I mentioned a couple of days ago that gas prices nationally, the average was near $5, and we've climbed a little bit since that, but we're not quite there yet. According to AAA, the national average today is $4.99 if you round to the nearest cent. That's the highest national average on record, but of course this is a national average, so your mileage may vary. But I'm also seeing some suggestions, Monet, that the May inflation figure we got today also only reflects part of the gas price rise that we've seen in recent weeks. And so it suggests that some of this will be built into the June number that we'll get next month.
Right. I mean, one of the big takeaways from the May inflation number is that people who have been predicting that we're nearing the peak of the run-up in inflation are very clearly wrong, because all of the underlying fundamentals still seem to be pointed in the upward direction. And it's really been kind of the stages of grief for President Biden and for some of his allies among policymakers and economists Obviously, first, they were suggesting that the price increases through 2021 were mostly transitory because there were temporary shortages of goods, and that was what was pushing the prices up. Now that it's persisted for well over a year, they have shed that explanation. But even as recently as the past couple of months, you've still heard President Biden implying that the rise in prices is about to plateau. And they basically seem to suggest that, there are specific causes of the problem that we can expect to be temporary, with Russia getting most of the blame there. But frankly, if you look at the breakdown of increases in prices across the economy, we can see that there are increases even in services. You mentioned the rising price of transportation. You see the same thing in food and hospitality. And these things obviously can't be chalked up to shortages of supply because these are services whose prices aren't anchored to hard goods. And so it's very clear that what we're seeing is sort of an abundance of money in the supply, which has been increased in part by federal spending, and that's something that Biden is determined to detract attention away from. And so recently he came out with his own plan for how they were going to get inflation under control. Basically, he said it's mostly in the hands of the Federal Reserve, and so that's one way of shedding blame for further inflation if we do see it. But he also said that he would try to tackle inflation by returning to certain democratic priorities. But we can see that federal spending has already added to the problem, and it's very unlikely that further spending on some of these democratic priorities like green energy is going to be very successful in restraining the future growth of inflation.
The other side of the household ledger is, of course, your earnings, your wages. And there, the news on Friday from the Labor Department was also bad. It says real average hourly earnings decreased by 3% seasonally adjusted from May 2021 to May 2022. There was also a decrease of 0.9% in the average work week. And so when you combine those, you get a 3.9% decrease in real average weekly earnings. And Kim, that's why people think the economy stinks. And the Biden administration seems to have been having trouble figuring that out because we have really low unemployment. It's easy to get a job, but this tight labor market is not really benefiting those workers who are seeing their earning power eroded. And it seems to me that this is President Biden's number one political problem as we get closer and closer to the November election.
It's the sweeping hit of inflation because it isn't just that prices are going up and prices of things that people need to survive, but that in the process, it erodes your wages so you have even less buying power. Now add in, as an aside as well, too, all this bad economic news, the stock market is taking a complete bath. And so for millions of Americans, in addition to those huge price tags, lowering wages, they're tuning in, if they have the stomach to, their 401k and watching their retirements take a hit and those balances go down. Interesting, concurrent with this, the University of Michigan released its preliminary data on consumer sentiment. They said that it has reached a record low between May and June. It's somewhere now comparable to the feelings that people had out there in the bad times of the 1980 recession. And of course, that's the word that the Biden administration should now also be fearing. It isn't just these inflation numbers going into the midterms, but there are a lot of economists now beginning to wonder if we aren't already in the beginning stages of an official recession. I've heard some people note that given China's lockdown, we could end up with a slight boost for our own net exports for this quarter, which could keep us right on the edge for maybe falling into the territory of recession. But the fundamentals are essentially there for that declaration. And you do not want to be a White House headed into a midterm with both recession and inflation hanging over you.
I would point to a poll by the Washington Post and George Mason University public policy outfit, and it asks people what the effect of inflation it has been on them personally. And the numbers here are pretty amazing. I think 87% of Americans are making more of an effort to find cheaper products. 77% are cutting back on entertainment or eating out. 74% have put off purchases. 59% are minimizing electricity, driving less, cutting back on the amount of money they're putting into their savings account. And at the bottom here, 27% say they have taken a second job or worked more hours. The other side of this, too, is expectations, because economists say that part of inflation is what people think inflation is going to be. And it gets built into those expectations as people negotiate their wages, their raises. And 30% of Americans expect inflation to be much worse in the next year. 36% say somewhat worse. And so, Monet, part of the dynamic here is the longer this inflation goes on, it seems to be, the more entrenched it's going to be.
Right. I think that poll you cited reveals an extremely important shift that might be taking place right now, because for almost a year, as inflation started to rise and continued to rise, we saw consumer spending essentially holding up from month to month. That was probably due in part to an excess of savings that had taken place over the course of the pandemic, because people weren't going out and spending as much money, and because their savings had been padded in part by federal support. And so even as prices were rising for quite a long time, you saw people were still spending about the same amount, particularly on some of these hard goods. But over the course of the past few months, you have seen those consumer spending numbers start to taper a little bit. People realize that they're running through their excess cash and that these high prices are going to remain for a long time. And so they know they have to adjust their behavior. And so that is going to start to affect corporate profits. Again, corporate profits were holding up for quite a while, even as some of these economic indicators were turning down, which stopped the stock market from tanking and which kept growth basically on pace. But now we're probably going to see a lot of these companies start to turn down. We've already seen it with companies like Netflix losing subscribers. That could be just the beginning. And so that could lead to exactly what you're implying, kind of a slowdown in growth that is sort of a second-order consequence of the increases in prices that we've seen as consumers start to tighten their belts.
And it puts the Federal Reserve in a much tighter spot. At the May meeting, the Fed approved a 0.5 percentage point increase in interest rates. The Journal's headline at the time said that it was the biggest hike since 2000. But now we have to ask ourselves, seeing more inflation numbers like this, whether Fed Chair Jay Powell has the stomach to do what it takes. And a soft landing, at least to my eyes, is looking like it's going to be harder and harder to pull off. Hang tight. We'll be right back. You're listening to Potomac Watch from the Wall Street Journal.
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome back. On Thursday night, the House committee probing the January 6, 2021 riot at the Capitol during the counting of electoral votes launched what we could call its TV mini-series, laying out some of its findings. Kim, what did you make of what happened on Thursday night and what the committee had?
It was really striking how produced this was, just as someone who's watched a lot of congressional hearings over the years. Watching these people use teleprompters to go through it. Obviously, the incredibly slick videos that were rolled out. There has been, by the way, some real criticism about some of the editing of those. In particular, the decision at the end of their big, long video, their opening video, to overlay Trump praising people, essentially saying there's a lot of love here, over the picture of rioters, when in fact he actually had made those statements prior at a speech he'd given well before any of this rioting started. I thought that it was interesting. There were a couple of things that were certainly new information. Most notably, I think some of the testimony that showed just how many aides and people around Trump had decided that these election fraud claims were not true, that they had been invalidated, and who told Trump that, which would suggest that he was more aware than people might have thought that this was a very weak case that he was making. But overall, my view was that the argument that the committee went into last year, they were very intent on trying to make the case that they were going to prove that Donald Trump somehow coordinated with or drove the actions of these people, as if there was going to be some smoking gun email somewhere in which Donald Trump told the Proud Boys, yeah, go attack the Capitol, I got your backs. It was very clear last night that they had never found anything like that. And so instead, they had to resort to this fallback where they're essentially actually trying to make the case that Donald Trump motivated people to do this by virtue of his tweets, etc. It's a much weaker case. And overall, the narrative that most of us have known for a very long time now, that he behaved irresponsibly, refused to stop calling for an overturn of election results, refused to engage on the day. We got a lot more of that, but not much that would change that overall view.
Well, let me start with the testimony on the election fraud claims. And we have a clip of former Attorney General Bill Barr.
I had 3 discussions with the president that I can recall. One was on November 23rd, one was on December 1st, and one was on December 14th. And I've been through sort of the give and take of those discussions. And in that context, I made it clear I did not agree with the idea of saying the election was stolen and putting out this stuff, which I told the president was bullshit. And, I didn't want to be a part of it. And that's one of the reasons that went into me deciding to leave when I did. I observed, I think it was on December 1st, that, how can you can't live in a world where the incumbent administration stays in power based on its view, unsupported by specific evidence, that there was fraud in the election.
There was another clip that was played from Alex Cannon's testimony. He was a lawyer for the Trump campaign, and he was recounting a conversation he had with White House Chief of Staff Mark Meadows. He said, "I remember sharing with him that we weren't finding anything that would be sufficient to change the results in any of the key states," unquote. And so, Monet, I think Bill Barr has said that before in pretty much those same terms publicly. But there may be some utility, to my mind, in getting these people, especially people who worked for the Trump campaign, lawyers, on the record about these fraud claims and what they made of them.
Right. I think the amount of detail that has come from seeing some of these testimonies is valuable in terms of knowing that the people in Trump's inner circle were very early to take the position that there really was a low chance of success litigating some of these fraud claims, that Donald Trump was made aware of that, and that he kept pushing for investigations of fraud incidents, not because of the advice he was getting, but in spite of it. And so certainly Democrats are trying to make that clear. And if their goal is to make Trump look really bad, they're succeeding. But I do also think it's interesting that Democrats' mission with this miniseries, as you put it, sort of resurfacing the January 6th incident, is not just to tar Trump, but also to try to imply that there is a broader push and a broader conspiracy among conservatives to try to overturn the election count, specifically at the Capitol, and more broadly to try to overturn the election through contesting some of the election results. And in that way, I think the hearing might actually be self-undermining in the sense that it just shows how widespread even Trump's inner circle was in opposing that push. And so I think that people already know that Donald Trump himself was really out on the deep end in terms of trying to keep the sort of fraud conspiracy charges in the air. But if Democrats' goal was to suggest that this was some kind of broad coordinated action among all conservatives, they really have failed to prove that whatsoever.
The second piece of information I'd point to as interesting is some more details about what Trump was allegedly doing while the riot was taking place. And we'll play here a clip of Republican Congresswoman Liz Cheney.
You will hear testimony that, quote, the president did not really want to put anything out calling off the riot or asking his supporters to leave. You will hear that President Trump was yelling and, quote, really angry at advisors who told him he needed to be doing something more. And aware of the rioters' chance to hang Mike Pence, the president responded with this sentiment, quote, maybe our supporters have the right idea. Mike Pence, quote, deserves it.
Now, I should say that President Trump on Truth Social is now denying that he said that. Here is his statement this morning. I never said or even thought of saying, hang Mike Pence. This is either a made-up story by somebody looking to become a star or fake news. And it's true that Liz Cheney did not say the source of that quotation. So we'll have to wait and find out who the committee said that, and whether they have it on audio or videotape. That could make a difference in the credibility of this claim. The other thing I would point to is The testimony by the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Mark Milley, who says that the order to deploy the National Guard to the Capitol came from Mike Pence, he seemed to suggest, not from President Trump. And so, Kim, I take your point that a lot of this we already knew, even if we didn't know it in such detail and we didn't have specific audio testimony from high-level officials saying that. I mean, some of this was reported in the press, cited to unnamed officials. On the other hand, it does give us a clearer and I think better picture of what actually went on that day.
Well, I guess so. I remember reading a piece that came out on January 11th, 2021. So this would have been a few days after it. The headline in the Washington Post, 6 hours of paralysis inside Trump's failure to act, etc. And so, we've long known that the president did little to nothing. He sat and watched TV a great deal of time, seemed to be very reluctant to do anything. And when he finally did, it was far too long after the fact. I suppose it is interesting to see the contrast of what Pence was doing, the fact that he seemed to be calling a lot of the shots. And there was even a discussion apparently with Meadows about some concern about the narrative that Trump wasn't doing anything and Pence was. So again, I guess these granular details are interesting, but to go back again to the big point, we've known for a long time about Trump's failures here. I think one of the goals of this committee obviously was to try to put him at the heart of the riot and suggest that he directed it. They don't have that. We'll see what else they produce over the coming week during their hearings. And again, it might fill in some blanks here or there, but overall, I didn't see a whole lot that was hugely new.
Well, I agree with Kim that they didn't have any evidence, or at least they didn't present any evidence on Thursday that Trump was secretly directing these rioters. No communications with the Proud Boys or the Oath Keepers were cited. And instead, there was this kind of language where they said that, witnesses, rioters were inspired by the president's call. They viewed his tweet as a call to arms. And Monet, I do think there's a risk of the committee overplaying its hand if they try to imply, just based on that kind of evidence, that this was a conspiracy in plain sight, they might say, and they try to refer President Trump a criminal referral based on that. I do think there's a risk, particularly with the rhetoric that some of the people on the committee are using, calling this a coup and so forth, that they get beyond what the evidence that they have really shows.
Well, I think it's important to remember that the Democrats realize they're speaking to two audiences here. And the first of those audiences is their own committed supporters. These are sort of animated, steady Democratic voters who very much do believe that Donald Trump incited the riot and also that there was a coordinated conspiracy to overturn the election. And so one of the reasons they want to shine a spotlight on the January 6th committee and get this information back into the headlines is just to juice turnout among their most loyal supporters in advance of the midterms. And so they probably see it as helpful in that vein to dial up the rhetoric as much as possible to imply that there could be criminal charges forthcoming. And frankly, a lot of the media probably will be very happy to run with that idea and just to float it in the headlines, even if behind the scenes they know better. They want to suggest that this could be the big moment that progressives have been waiting for, where finally the hammer is going to drop on President Trump. But I think what you were suggesting is that they could be self-undermining if they do imply to more moderate voters, some of whom are very disappointed with President Trump and Republicans, that this was a coup or that they would be willing to sort of push for criminal charges, when those moderate voters probably see the situation a little bit more clearly, which is that January 6th was a reprehensible incident, but that it didn't represent any kind of coordinated action. And you're probably right that it would be a big overreach on the part of the Democrats among those voters if they did push too far in that direction. And so they're probably trying to sort of walk the line between ginning up their own supporters and going too far in a way that would scandalize more moderate ones.
Thank you, Monet and Kim. Thank you all for listening. You can email us at pwpodcast@wsj.com. If you like the show, please hit that subscribe button on your favorite podcast app, and we'll be back next week with another edition of Potomac Watch.